you forget.
I'm supposed to talk about the party.
Yesterday we found out that we had a change in program, so nobody will be singing for you today. You're lucky that I'm not singing for you.
You can sing.
They got the stomach flu. So I said, fine, don't come.
Yeah, thank you.
But fear not, we have been rescued.
Sort of.
We have a great program lined up. Ellen Bell will be talking about the Donner Party. She volunteers up at the Donner State Park. And so let me introduce Ellen Bell.
It's so nice to be here and see so many of you that I know and love. I know this wasn't exactly what you expected. Singing Christmas carols, the Donner Party. But you're lucky also that I'm not singing. And so what would make somebody leave a farm that is doing really well, like George Donnors was, or a cabinet-making business like James Reed in Springfield, Illinois? And who else lived in Springfield, in Illinois? This is a test for you.
Lincoln.
Yes, and it so happens, I looked at the date. We're talking about 1846, when the Donner Party started, and Lincoln was a young lawyer at the time, and he actually was a neighbor of James Reed, so they knew each other. I thought that was an interesting connection. Anyway, the Donners, oh, and why would they leave? Does anybody know what would make them leave prosperous farms and businesses?
Gold.
It's cold there. What else?
Gold.
Gold. Oh, no, not yet. The 49ers, you guys, 1849. Oh, didn't happen till then. Okay, also it turns out that there's a lot of marshland in the prairie area, and people were sick. They had, people got tuberculosis, and they got other diseases that we don't even think about anymore. And they're just people who wanted to leave because they could and move on to California, which was, supposed to be this wonderful place. And it was by the time they finally got there. Okay, so the everybody else kind of met in independent. Oh, could we do the first? Sure. Perfect. Okay, so I just pulled a couple of pictures for you, nothing fancy, but well, it's actually over here where they started. So everybody kind of met at Independence, Missouri, and the Donners and the Reeds didn't leave until the beginning of May. Even Lansford Hastings, who is the sleazeball of sleazeballs, who suggested the cutoff to them, and that's what made them take so long that they ended up being stranded in the mountains. Even he said no one should be leaving in a wagon after May 1st. So, okay, that was their first mistake. Then they traveled to Independence, and James Reed, being the cabinet maker, had 3 wagons, one of which Virginia Reed called the Palace Car. And it was actually almost 2-story. It had, they were bringing Margaret Reed, his wife, they were bringing her mother, even though she was sick with tuberculosis and probably wouldn't make it, and in fact she died on the road. But they wanted her to have a little parlor, so they had kind of a living room. It was sort of the first RV. Anyway, and it had a little wood-burning stove, and it even had a little loft for the kids to sleep in. But it was really heavy. And so what happened is, that was another problem. It slowed everybody down, and people weren't happy. So anyway, all right, so everybody met in Independence. And there, by the way, Lansford Hastings had written this book, which I can't even remember what it's called, but it was encouraging people to come to California. He was a land salesman. He was 28 years old, but he was slick, and he was a good talker. By the time everybody got to, he was telling everybody to come to Fort Bridger, and actually, this was the cutoff now to the regular way to go to California was this way. But he was saying to go to Fort Bridger, and I think he was, I don't know if he was getting something like extra money because he was funneling money into Fort Bridger or not to the two owners of the fort. And by the way, you guys all know that these forts were not military forts. They were just like general stores to just for people to buy goods. Okay, so they met, well, they were late in meeting, what is the matter with me? Hastings. And so they, he left them a letter saying that, that he would come back and get them. Well, he didn't come back, so they sent 3 people out, James Reed and 2 other people, and they rode and they found Hastings. So he came back with them to just, and he said, well, I can't really stay with you because I have all these other wagons. It's kind of over that way. And they left. And by the way, the decision was made, all men, of course. Tamsin Donner, who was George Donner's wife, said, I don't really think this is a good idea. The mountain men who really know this territory are all saying, don't go. But the mountain men were smelly and grisly looking, and Hastings was slick and a good talker, and James Reed wanted it to be true, because supposedly it was going to cut up 350 miles from their trip. So he talked everybody else into going on, taking the cutoff. And now they had to kind of figure it out for themselves. The regular trail was, rutted, and I mean, so many wagons had gone through it, it was really easy to follow. But of course the cutoff, only one other party had gone that way. They got to the Wasatch Mountains, which are here, actually, right there. And it was so hard going that they had to cut boughs of, trees and lay them down for the wagons to go over. They were making 1.5 miles a day. And then they got to the Great Salt Lake, and they had to, and I'm not going to go through all of that stuff. You guys, how many of you have driven across the Great Salt Lake? So you know what that looks like. How many of you have ever been to Donner Lake in the winter? Okay. Because there is a lot of snow there, a lot of snow. Could we do
Next slide.
yeah. Well, actually, yeah, so before we even get to it, okay, after the Great Salt Lake, there's a 40-mile desert. And when they got to the 40-mile desert, they were so tired, they had started to lose, animals were starving and not getting it. They had hardly any water, and then it was alkaline across the Great Salt Lake. Uh-oh.
It's okay.
Okay, good. And there was a time where it was at the end of the day, the wagons were trying to climb this mountain and get across, and there were, the Graves wagon was being pulled by oxen, and the Reed wagon was being pulled by oxen, and the Reed wagon decided they were gonna try to go ahead of the Graves wagon, and they hit each other, and it knocked one of the oxen, and anyway, people lost their tempers. And so Margaret Reed got into the middle of this because James was arguing with this guy Snyder, who was the teamster for Mr. Graves. And she got in the middle, and just as James Reed was, just as Snyder had his whip out and was trying to move the oxen on, and hit her by accident, and James Reed lost it, and he took out his hunting knife and he stabbed Snyder. And within hours, Snyder was dead. Well, he really didn't mean it, but he was still dead. So the group was, had to decide, what do we do? And this guy Keseberg, who was, there were 4 German families that came, and Keseberg was one of them. He was the most educated, but he was not a nice guy. Anyway, he wanted to hang James Reed, and they even had these things that came out from their wagons that they could hang him from. But everybody else voted, no, let's just banish him. And that was a death sentence anyway. So they banished him. Then I didn't tell you that the Donnors, actually the two Donner brothers, George and Jacob, and their families were already ahead. I don't know how that happened, but they were ahead of the group. So anyway, when James Reed was banished, he started, he just left with nothing. But Virginia, his daughter, who was 13, she followed after him with some food and with a rifle. Well, he eventually caught up to the Donners, and they said, we can't just let you go out there with nothing. So they sent one of their teamsters with him and a horse. So he actually made it to Sutter's Fort, and then was hoping to come back and get help and come back. But what was happening in California at the time, do you know? Okay, well it started to snow on the pass, but what was going on in Sacramento at the time, and Yerba Buena, which is San Francisco? It was the Mexican-American War. And there was nobody really that James Reed tried to get, Sutter had money that he was offering, but there weren't any bodies because they were all fighting. So he said, okay, I'll fight in the war for you if you'll then promise to send people to help save the families. So he went off and fought. Oh, and incidentally, he happened to see some orchards in the Santa Clara Valley that he picked up for a song. I mean, and people in the Donner Party knew that James Reed was this kind of a guy, and that he was autocratic, and he was just too full of himself and too rich, and they didn't want him to be a leader, even though he was the natural leader of the group. So that's why they elected George Donner, and they called him Captain Donner, but he really wasn't a military captain at all. So anyway, all right, so let's get to the part that you really want to hear about. They finally made it across the Truckee Meadows. By the time they made it to Truckee Meadows is where Reno is, so by the time they made it up into the mountains, this is actually Donner Lake, it was the end of October 30th. And some of the members, they were so exhausted that they couldn't go any further. They just couldn't go any further. And this guy, Charles Stanton, who really wasn't even a mountain guy, he was from Chicago, but he could see that he didn't have a family or anything. But he could see up on the pass that it already was snowing, and in fact it had snowed about 5 or 6 feet. But it hadn't yet snowed down on Donner Lake. So there were several people who tried to make it up to the pass, but it was too hard. And they certainly couldn't do it with wagons. So by the time they came back down, it had started to snow at Donner Lake. By the way, the Donners had been caught 7 miles away up at Alder Creek. I'm going to show that to you in a minute. But, and I'll tell you more about that. Oh, okay, let's try it. Maybe. Okay, it's east and a little bit north, and you actually can visit Alder Creek, the site, as well as the site at Donner Lake where where the rest of the people ended up. So, we have the Reed family, and James wasn't there, so Margaret and her 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son, ended up being cared for by another family. There was the Breen family, who Patrick Breen was the head of that household, and his wife Peggy, and their 7 kids, and they all made it out, all of them. The Reeds made it out. The Donners had been stopped up at Alder Creek.
You want the map or
The one where the cabins are. Let me.
not this one?
Not the one we already saw. No, but this is what it looks like in the winter if you haven't seen it. That's okay. Let's go back to the cabin. That's fine. Okay. So this is what there was actually one cabin already at Donner Lake from the Stevens Townsend party that had been there 2 years before. So one family moved into that cabin, and then they built 2 more. And they were not right on the lake, and they were not next to each other, because by then, it was sort of a fight for how much food you could have. The cattle had either died from thirst or hunger, and the oxen as well, and they were I don't even remember what I was going to say. Okay, so they had, the Greens actually had killed more of their cattle ahead, but other people were hoping that they could keep them alive and then kill them little by little so that they would have food, you know, through the time that they were stuck there. So they were guarding it for their own families, the food. So they built 3 cabins. There was one for the Graves family and Franklin Graves was from Vermont, and that was a good thing because he's the only one who knew about snowshoes. I always thought everybody who lived, I mean, I grew up in LA, and I thought everybody who came from Illinois or places where it snowed knew about snowshoes, but they didn't. So anyway, they built these cabins. They had no windows or doors. They just had, there are no holes even for windows and only holes for doors. So it was really dark in there. They covered them as best they could, and then they covered them with with hides, animal hides if they could, which little by little they ended up eating because after they ran out of meat, they ate. Okay, so you're thinking, I was thinking anyway, why didn't they fish? They're right on a lake. Well, they didn't really know how. They're mostly farmers, and they didn't know about trout fishing, apparently. So they caught 1 or 2 fish, and that was it. And then, of course, it started to get icy, so the lake was iced over. This guy, William Eddy, who was a young father, and he was there with his wife and 2 little kids, he was a hunter. So he took the rifle out, and he actually shot a bear. But you know, there were a lot of people. It was 92 people starting. 6 of them died on the way. And then, so they still had, what, 82? Oh, 86. Well, because then other people died right in the beginning. Okay, yeah, so they still had a lot of people to feed. So a bear really was good for a little while, but not very long. And then all the other animals had run into the woods or something and hidden, and the cattle were covered over by snow and ice, and there was nobody left. They still had they did have the oxen yokes, and so this is where Franklin Graves came in. There was a group, they chose the 15 strongest people that they thought really had a chance to get out. And Franklin Graves they found 14 yokes from the oxen, and I don't know if you have ever seen a yoke from oxen. We have them at the Donnors State Park, and they're really heavy. But it was still worked to sit on the top of the snow because it's spread out over the snow. So they wound as much leather strappings as they could around it, and 14 people were able to walk on that, and 1 person still was trying to follow in the footsteps, and but they didn't make it very far. Out of that snowshoe party, they called Forlorn Hope, 7 of them actually made it. And where they climbed down to, they called it Bear Valley, and I kept thinking, Bear Valley? Like where you guys have your cabin? No, it's not that Bear Valley. It's below Marysville. Kind of, actually probably closest to Grass Valley. And you can see the site today. But anyway, so that was the first place they ever saw brown earth for the first time since the snow. So 7 of those people made it, and then there were several rescue parties, 3 rescue parties actually after that.